The man we buried 18 years ago just walked back into this house," Victoria whispered as the dining room fell silent around her. Nobody moved after that. The only sound inside the Harrison estate was the soft crackling from the fireplace beneath the marble mantel and the faint clink of Eleanor's wine glass trembling against her plate. I stood just inside the doorway with rainwater still dripping from the shoulders of my old denim jacket, while every member of my family stared at me like they had seen a ghost climb out of the grave. The chandelier above the oak table cast a warm golden light across the room, but nothing about that moment felt warm. Isabel was the first to recover. She slowly placed the wine bottle down beside David's untouched glass and folded her hands carefully, elegant as always, though I noticed the tension in her jaw immediately. She recognized me before anyone else did. "Harrison," she said softly, almost testing whether my name still belonged in that house. Across the table, David looked older than I remembered. The expensive suit, the dark circles under his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged beneath the pressure of carrying a family that had already collapsed years ago. He stared at me without blinking. Ethan rose halfway from his chair near the staircase, confusion written across his face. He had been a child the last time he saw me. Now he looked at me the way people look at old photographs they suddenly realize were hiding the truth the entire time. Eleanor remained seated beneath the chandelier, her pale hands frozen in her lap. She would not look at me. That hurt more than I expected. James, standing near the fireplace in his black suit and white gloves, lowered his head slightly. Not in shock, in respect. He was the only person in the room who looked unsurprised. Victoria finally stood from the far end of the table, her pearls catching the light as she straightened her spine like a queen preparing for war. "You should not be here," she said calmly. I removed my wet gloves one finger at a time and placed them beside an empty chair near the end of the table. Nobody offered me a seat. Nobody welcomed me home. But nobody told me to leave either. I looked around the massive dining room slowly. The portraits were still hanging. The grandfather clock still ticked beside the staircase. Even the silver candle holders were exactly where my father used to keep them. 18 years had passed, and this family had changed nothing except the truth. Then I looked directly at Victoria and spoke the words she feared most. I came back because someone in this house forged my father's signature before he died. Nobody spoke after I accused someone in the house of forging my father's signature. The silence stretched across the dining room like a wire ready to snap. Rain pressed softly against the tall windows overlooking the east garden, while thunder rolled somewhere far beyond the hills surrounding the estate. Victoria slowly lifted her wine glass and took a careful sip without breaking eye contact with me. She had always been dangerous when she looked calm. "You disappear for 18 years and walk back in here making accusations?" she asked quietly. "That is an interesting strategy, Harrison." I pulled out the empty chair near the end of the oak table and sat down for the first time since returning to the estate. The chair creaked softly beneath me. Across from me, David rubbed one hand over his face like he was trying to wake himself from a bad dream. "We buried you already," he muttered under his breath. Eleanor flinched at those words. I noticed immediately. She still carried guilt like a stone around her neck. Ethan remained standing near the staircase, staring between all of us as though he had suddenly realized the family stories he grew up hearing were incomplete. "Nobody buried me," I said calmly. "I left because somebody wanted me gone." Isabel leaned back slightly in her chair, elegant fingers wrapped around the stem of her glass. "You were accused of stealing from the family trust," she said carefully. "Everyone remembers that." I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because the lie had survived longer than I expected. "No," I replied. "Everyone remembers what they were told to remember." James quietly stepped forward from beside the fireplace and refilled Eleanor's water glass with steady hands. The old butler never interrupted family discussions, but tonight, he lingered near the table instead of disappearing into the kitchen like usual. He was listening. That mattered. Thomas arrived 15 minutes later carrying a leather folder beneath one arm, his silver glasses fogged from the rain outside. The family lawyer stopped cold the moment he saw me sitting at the table. For the first time that night, somebody looked genuinely frightened. "Harrison," he said slowly, "I was told you would never come back." "A lot of people believed convenient things 18 years ago," I answered. Thomas removed his coat carefully and glanced toward Victoria before taking his seat beside Eleanor. That single glance told me more than words ever could. Ethan noticed it too. I could see the shift in his expression immediately. The beginning of suspicion. The beginning of doubt. Then Thomas opened the leather folder with trembling fingers and quietly said the words that changed the atmosphere inside the mansion forever. Before your father died, he amended the inheritance agreement 3 times. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked loudly as Thomas adjusted the papers inside the leather folder with unsteady hands. Nobody interrupted him. Even Victoria remained silent now, though I could feel her calculating every possible way to regain control of the room. The storm outside had grown heavier, rain sliding down the tall windows beside the fireplace in slow silver streams. Ethan finally sat down beside David, but his eyes never left Thomas. He looked like someone hearing the foundation beneath his life beginning to crack. 3 amendments? David asked quietly. Why would father change the inheritance agreement 3 times? Thomas cleared his throat before answering. Because he no longer trusted the people around him. The room became still again after that. Isabel lowered her gaze toward the table for only a second, but I noticed it. So did James. The old butler stood near the wall beneath one of the family portraits, silent and unreadable, though his eyes followed every movement in the room. Eleanor slowly folded her trembling hands together. Your father was afraid near the end, she whispered softly. Victoria immediately turned toward her. Eleanor, just one word. Calm, sharp, warning her without raising her voice. I remembered that tone well. It was the same voice Victoria used 18 years ago when she convinced the family I had stolen from the trust accounts. Back then, everyone listened to her because she spoke with certainty. People confuse certainty with truth all the time. Thomas removed a sealed envelope from the folder and placed it carefully on the table. The cream-colored paper looked old, the edges slightly worn with age. My father's handwriting was still visible across the front. Harrison. Ethan leaned forward immediately. That was addressed to him, he asked. Thomas nodded once. Your grandfather instructed me to deliver this only if Harrison ever returned to the estate. David stared at the envelope like it might explode. You never told us about this. I was legally forbidden to, Thomas replied quietly. Victoria's expression hardened for the first time that night. Very small changes. A tighter jaw, a colder stare. Most people would not notice them. But I had spent half my life watching that woman manipulate entire rooms without ever raising her voice. Isabel finally spoke again, her tone smooth and controlled. Perhaps this conversation should wait until tomorrow morning. Everyone is exhausted. No, Ethan said suddenly. Every head turned toward him in surprise. Even he looked startled by his own interruption. He swallowed hard before continuing. If grandfather left something for Harrison, then maybe we deserve to know why. I looked at Ethan carefully then. The boy had his father's eyes, but not his weakness. That mattered more than he realized. Thomas slowly slid the sealed envelope across the oak table toward me. There is one more thing, he said quietly. Your father attached a handwritten note to the final amendment. Victoria stood abruptly from her chair. Do not read that letter in this room. But it was already too late. Victoria moved toward me before I could touch the envelope. The chandelier light reflected against the diamonds around her neck. As she stopped beside the table with the controlled grace of someone used to commanding every room she entered. That letter was written by a dying man under heavy medication, she said calmly. It will solve nothing. Thomas looked uncomfortable hearing that. He removed his glasses slowly and polished them with a folded handkerchief, buying himself time before speaking. Your father was fully coherent when he signed the final amendment, he said quietly. I personally witnessed it. Victoria turned toward him with a look sharp enough to silence most people. And yet you hid these documents for nearly 2 decades. Thomas lowered his eyes. Because I was instructed to. Eleanor suddenly stood from her chair so quickly that it startled everyone at the table. Her pastel cardigan hung loosely from her shoulders, and for the first time since I returned, she looked directly at me. Her eyes were glassy with regret. Your father knew something was wrong before he died, she whispered. He stopped trusting the financial reports. He thought someone inside the family was moving money. David frowned immediately. What financial reports? Nobody answered him right away. That silence said more than words ever could. Ethan noticed it too. I could see him putting pieces together in real time. The hidden tension, the fear every time inheritance was mentioned. The way Victoria controlled conversations before they reached dangerous territory. James quietly stepped closer to Eleanor as though afraid she might collapse. The old butler had served this family for over 40 years. He had witnessed every lie this house buried beneath polished floors and expensive wine. Isabel rose from her chair then, smoothing invisible wrinkles from the front of her cream-colored dress. "This is becoming unhealthy," she said softly. "We are talking about events from 18 years ago. Whatever happened back then cannot be changed now." "That depends on what was stolen," I replied. Her expression barely shifted, but her fingers tightened slightly around the back of her chair. Another small crack beneath the surface. David looked exhausted. "Can somebody please explain what is happening?" he asked. "All my life I was told Harrison destroyed the family trust and disappeared after taking money from grandfather." Ethan turned toward him immediately, but nobody ever saw proof. David stared at his son in surprise. "Victoria said there was proof," Ethan continued carefully. "But every document connected to Harrison disappeared after grandfather died." Victoria slowly smiled then. "Cold, controlled, dangerous. You are very young, Ethan," she said. "Young people often mistake suspicion for intelligence. And older people often mistake power for truth," I answered quietly. The room went still again. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills surrounding the estate. Then I finally opened the envelope with my father's name written across the front in faded black ink. Inside was a single handwritten note folded beside the amended inheritance papers. I unfolded the note carefully while every person at the table watched my hands. The first line made my blood run cold. "If you are reading this, Harrison, then the wrong child paid for my mistakes." Nobody at the table spoke after I read my father's note aloud. The rain continued tapping softly against the tall dining room windows, while the grandfather clock counted each passing second like a warning. Ethan looked pale now, his eyes moving slowly from Victoria to Thomas and then back toward me. He was beginning to understand that this family had not been built on loyalty. It had been built on silence. David leaned heavily against the back of his chair, exhausted confusion written across his face. "What mistakes?" he finally asked. "What was grandfather talking about?" Eleanor lowered her eyes immediately. Victoria remained standing beside the table, perfectly composed despite the storm building beneath the surface of the room. "Your grandfather regretted many things near the end of his life," she said calmly. "Age makes people emotional." "No," Thomas interrupted quietly. Every person at the table looked toward him in surprise. The old lawyer swallowed hard before continuing. "Your father was very specific during our final meetings." Victoria's expression darkened slightly. "Thomas, he believed financial records had been altered." Thomas continued anyway. "He believed Harrison was framed before the internal audit was completed." David stared at him. "You told us the audit proved everything." Thomas removed his glasses slowly again. "That was what I was instructed to say publicly." Ethan stood up, so suddenly his chair scraped sharply against the hardwood floor. "Publicly," he repeated. "You mean everyone lied?" "Enough," Victoria said coldly. Her voice cut through the room instantly. James stepped quietly toward the sideboard and began collecting untouched dinner plates, though nobody had truly eaten all evening. His movements remained calm, but I noticed something important. He kept avoiding Victoria's eyes. Isabel crossed her arms lightly against herself and walked toward the fireplace, careful and elegant even under pressure. "We are letting emotions distort facts," she said. "There was missing money. Harrison disappeared immediately afterward. That is not coincidence." "I disappeared because nobody wanted the truth," I answered. The firelight reflected across the old oak walls as silence settled over the room again. Memories returned slowly then. My father growing distant before his death, locked office doors late at night, financial ledgers disappearing from shelves, Victoria controlling every conversation after family meetings ended. Back then, I had been too angry to notice how carefully everything was orchestrated around me. Eleanor suddenly covered her mouth with trembling fingers. "I saw something," she whispered. Victoria turned toward her sharply. "Do not do this." But Eleanor looked at me instead. Tears had gathered in her eyes now. "The night before your father changed the final amendment," she said quietly, "I saw Victoria leaving his study carrying trust account documents." The room froze completely. Even Isabel stopped moving near the fireplace. David stared at his mother in disbelief. Ethan looked horrified. Victoria did not react right away. She simply adjusted one of the diamond bracelets around her wrist and said the most dangerous sentence I had heard all night. "If we are finally telling the truth," she said calmly, "then perhaps Harrison should explain why he really came back now." I looked at Victoria for a long moment before answering her question. The fire behind her had burned lower now, casting darker shadows across the massive dining room walls and the portraits watching from above. Nobody touched their food anymore. Half-filled wine glasses sat abandoned across the oak table, while the storm outside continued rolling through the hills surrounding the estate. "I came back," I said quietly, "because somebody contacted me 3 months ago." That changed the atmosphere immediately. Ethan leaned forward. David looked confused again. Isabel became very still near the fireplace. Only Victoria remained calm, though I noticed her fingers tighten slightly against the back of her chair. "Who contacted you?" David asked. I reached into the inside pocket of my weathered jacket and removed a folded envelope worn soft from travel. "The letter had no return address," I said. "Only one sentence inside." Slowly, I unfolded the paper and read the line aloud. "The person who destroyed your life is preparing to destroy the next generation too." Nobody spoke after that. Even the grandfather clock seemed quieter somehow. Thomas looked genuinely shaken now. "You never mentioned another letter," he said carefully. "Because I did not trust anyone connected to this family," I answered. Ethan looked toward Victoria almost instinctively. She noticed immediately. "You are all acting like frightened children chasing conspiracy stories," she said smoothly. "Harrison disappears for 18 years and suddenly returns with mysterious letters and dramatic accusations. Does nobody here find that convenient? Maybe because nothing in this family has ever been honest." Ethan replied before anyone else could speak. David stared at his son in surprise again. The boy had reached a point where silence no longer felt safe. I understood that feeling well. James quietly placed a silver tray of fresh coffee near the center of the table. His hands remained steady, but when he stepped beside me, he paused for the smallest moment. "Your old room remains untouched, sir," he said softly. Victoria turned sharply toward him. "James, but..." The old butler simply lowered his head respectfully and stepped away again. Eleanor sat down slowly, looking exhausted now. "I begged your father to stop investigating the trust accounts," she whispered toward me. "He became obsessed near the end. He stopped sleeping. He thought someone close to him was moving money through shell companies." Thomas looked up immediately. "Shell companies?" Eleanor nodded weakly. "I heard him arguing with Victoria about it 2 nights before he died." David pushed back from the table and stood abruptly. "No," he muttered. "No, this is insane." Isabel moved toward him immediately, resting one careful hand against his arm. "David, breathe," she said softly. But I noticed something else then. Ethan was staring toward the staircase behind Victoria. Following his eyes, I saw Sophia standing quietly near the hallway entrance with rainwater still clinging to her coat. The young attorney held a thick folder against her chest and looked directly at me before speaking. "I believe I found the missing trust records," she said. And for the first time all night, Victoria lost control of her expression completely. Sophia stepped fully into the dining room while thunder rolled outside the estate like distant artillery across the hills. Water dripped softly from the edge of her dark coat onto the hardwood floor as every person at the table turned toward her. She looked young against the weight of that old house, but there was nothing uncertain in her expression. Victoria recovered first. "This is a private family matter," she said coldly. "You should not be here." Sophia held the thick folder tighter against her chest. "Actually, Mrs. Walker, I was hired 6 weeks ago to review dormant trust activity connected to Harrison Holdings." That sentence landed harder than anyone expected. David looked completely lost now. "Harrison Holdings?" he repeated. "That company was dissolved years ago." "No," Sophia answered calmly. "It was hidden." The room fell silent again. Ethan stared at Sophia with open disbelief while Thomas slowly removed his glasses one more time, his face growing paler by the second. James quietly closed the dining room doors behind Sophia, sealing the family inside the room together. I noticed Victoria watching him carefully after that. She was beginning to realize the balance inside the house had shifted. Sophia walked toward the table and placed the folder directly in front of Thomas. 3 offshore accounts continued operating after Harrison left the estate, she said. Millions of dollars moved through them over the last 18 years. David looked at me immediately. You had secret accounts? No. Sophia interrupted before I could answer. The accounts were opened using Harrison's name after he disappeared. Ethan pushed himself away from the table and stood again. You mean somebody kept using his identity all these years? Sophia nodded once. Whoever controlled those accounts had access to the original trust documentation and family signatures. Nobody looked at Victoria directly then, but the entire room shifted toward her anyway. Isabel slowly crossed her arms beside the fireplace. For the first time since I arrived, even she looked unsettled. This proves nothing, Victoria said smoothly. Large families use layered financial structures all the time. Not after accusing someone publicly of fraud and forcing them out of the family, Sophia replied. Her voice remained respectful, but steady, dangerous in its own way. Eleanor covered her eyes briefly with trembling fingers. Dear God, she whispered. David looked like a man watching his entire life collapse room by room around him. Mother, he said quietly, did you know about these accounts? Victoria turned toward him slowly. Be very careful what you are implying. I am not implying anything anymore, David answered. That surprised everyone, including himself. I could see it in his face. Years of pressure were finally cracking open. Ethan moved closer to Sophia and looked down at the financial documents spread across the table. These transfers continued until last month, he said quietly. Sophia nodded, which means whoever controlled the accounts believed Harrison would never come back. The fire crackled softly behind us. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed easily. Then Thomas turned another page inside the folder and suddenly froze. His eyes widened behind his glasses as he stared at one specific signature near the bottom of the document. Very slowly, he lifted his head toward Victoria. This transfer was approved 2 days after your husband died, he said quietly. And the authorization signature belongs to someone who was already dead. The dining room felt colder after Thomas revealed the signature belonged to a dead man. Nobody reached for their wine anymore. Even the fire in the marble fireplace had burned low, leaving only dim orange light flickering across the old oak walls and family portraits hanging above us like silent witnesses. Victoria remained standing at the far end of the table, perfectly still beneath the chandelier. But something had changed. For the first time in 18 years, the room was no longer moving around her. David slowly lowered himself back into his chair, staring at the financial documents spread across the table like they belonged to strangers. This cannot be real, he whispered. Father would never allow this. Your father did not know, Eleanor answered softly. Her voice sounded smaller now, worn down by years of silence and regret. By the time he realized money was disappearing, he was already sick. Ethan looked toward me again, searching my face carefully. You really never touched those accounts? He asked. Not once, I replied. After I left this house, I worked construction jobs across 3 states just to survive. I lived in cheap apartments, roadside motels, anywhere I could afford. Meanwhile, somebody here continued using my name. The shame on David's face deepened after hearing that. Isabel quietly walked back toward the table, though her composure no longer looked natural. She kept glancing toward Victoria now instead of controlling the room herself. That told me everything I needed to know about where her loyalty truly lived. Sophia opened another section of the folder and slid several printed pages toward Thomas. There is more, she said carefully. The shell companies were connected to a private trust restructuring approved 5 years ago. Thomas scanned the documents slowly before his face tightened again. This transferred controlling interest of Harrison Estate Holdings into a secondary beneficiary structure, he said quietly. Ethan frowned immediately. Who became the beneficiary? Nobody answered fast enough. That hesitation was answer enough already. Sophia finally looked directly toward Isabel. The restructuring placed future control of the estate under David Walker and his spouse. David turned toward his wife immediately. You knew about this? Isabel's expression remained calm, but too calm now. Practiced calm. Your mother handled most of the estate planning after your father became overwhelmed, she answered softly. I signed what the attorneys prepared, without reading it. Ethan asked sharply. Isabel looked toward him with visible irritation. Do not speak to me like I am on trial. Maybe everybody in this room should be, Ethan replied. Victoria finally stepped forward then, her heels echoing softly against the hardwood floor. "Enough," she said coldly. "This family built everything in this house through sacrifice and discipline. Harrison abandoned us. The estate survived because I protected it." "Protected it from what?" I asked quietly. "The truth." For the first time all night, Victoria's control slipped completely. "The truth," she repeated sharply. "The truth is your father trusted the wrong son." Silence crashed over the room after those words. Eleanor began quietly crying beside Thomas. David stared at his mother in disbelief. Ethan looked physically sick, and James, standing silently near the fireplace, slowly removed a small brass key from his pocket before placing it carefully beside my hand on the table. "Your father told me to keep this safe until you returned," he said softly. "It opens the study upstairs that Mrs. Walker ordered sealed 18 years ago." The brass key felt cold in my hand as the entire dining room stared at it in silence. Rain continued sliding down the tall windows behind us, while thunder moved farther into the distance beyond the hills. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Even Victoria seemed caught off guard by James revealing the existence of the sealed study. The old butler stood quietly beside the fireplace, with his hands folded behind his back, but for the first time in decades, he was no longer acting like a servant. He was acting like a witness finally prepared to speak. "There is no reason to open that room," Victoria said sharply. "Your father sealed old records years ago." "No," James answered calmly. "You sealed the room the morning after Mr. Walker passed away." The silence after that felt suffocating. David slowly turned toward his mother again, and this time there was no confusion left in his eyes, only disappointment. "What is inside the study?" he asked quietly. Victoria did not answer immediately. Isabel stepped closer to her instinctively, like someone moving toward the strongest side in a negotiation. Sophia remained near the staircase holding the trust documents tightly against her chest, while Ethan stared at the brass key in my hand as though it might unlock his entire childhood. Eleanor finally spoke through trembling tears. "Your father wanted Harrison to see those records himself," she whispered. "He told me the truth was hidden somewhere inside that room." I stood slowly from my chair then. The old oak floor creaked beneath my boots as every person at the table watched me move toward the staircase. Nobody tried stopping me, not even Victoria. That was how I knew she was afraid of whatever waited upstairs. Ethan moved first. "I am coming with you," he said immediately. David hesitated only a moment before standing too. "So am I." Isabel looked alarmed. "David, this is becoming dangerous for the family." "Maybe the family became dangerous a long time ago," he answered quietly. Those words seemed to hit Eleanor the hardest. James walked toward the staircase and switched on the dim wall lights leading to the second-floor hallway. The mansion suddenly felt older than ever before. Not grand, not elegant, just heavy with secrets that had been sitting untouched for nearly 2 decades. Sophia followed behind us while Thomas remained downstairs beside the dining table, looking exhausted beneath the chandelier light. Victoria stayed near the fireplace watching every step we took upward. Her silence felt colder than anger. The hallway upstairs smelled faintly of dust and cedarwood. Family portraits lined the walls beneath soft yellow lights, generations of walkers staring down at us as though they already knew what waited ahead. James stopped outside a dark wooden door at the far end of the corridor. The brass nameplate still read Charles Walker Study. Untouched, forgotten, buried. I stepped forward slowly and slid the old brass key into the lock. My hand paused for just a second before turning it. The mechanism clicked loudly in the silent hallway. Behind me, nobody breathed. Then I opened the door and saw something inside the study that made every person behind me stop cold. On the desk beside my father's chair sat a cassette recorder with a yellow note attached to it in his handwriting. "For Harrison, play this only when the family is finally together again."